Hi, I'm Dr. Matthews. I'm here today to give you a quick introduction to exercise assessment and prescription, which is a series of lecture videos that I have here that you can watch. But this will give you a little bit of a feel for what's coming in the lectures ahead. With this, we're going to have a couple different textbooks that I'm recommending that you have at different times. I'm going to refer to figures in those textbooks, and I won't be putting those figures directly into the PowerPoint for copyright reasons. So those two textbooks are going to be the American College of Sports Medicine, or ACSM's Resources for the Exercise Physiologist, the second edition, and you can scan this QR code here and it'll take you to where you can find the textbook I'm talking about. And for this introduction, I am going to be pulling some of my information from Chapter 1. The other textbook is also an ACSM textbook. This is the ACSM's Guidelines for Exercise Testing and Prescriptions, the 10th edition. Again, here's the QR code where you can find that textbook, and also I will be pulling some information for this particular video from Chapter 1 of that textbook. So in order to understand why it's so important for us to study exercise assessment and prescription, let's start from sort of a global, big scale here and look at the leading causes of death in the United States. All right, so cardiovascular disease is the leading cause, the single leading cause, with 31% of all people who die in the United States, at least back in 2007, it's about the same now, but about 31% of the people who die from cardiovascular disease or something related to their development of cardiovascular disease. This is ahead of cancer, it's ahead of different respiratory diseases, it's ahead of accidents, ahead of Alzheimer's, as well as ahead of lots of other conditions that fall under this other category. So if you look here, we do have other being a fairly large chunk of the pie, but again, that's a lot of different diseases clumped together as other. While cardiovascular disease is a very large chunk, cancer is a fairly large chunk as well, but good thing is exercise is going to protect against cardiovascular disease as well as some types of cancer. So this again is the reason why we're talking about this. So when talking about mortality, which just means death, the major modifiable risk factors that lead to death, regardless of the cause of the death, are going to be smoking, which causes about 18% of the deaths in the United States. The next one being a combination of poor diet and poor physical activity habits, which together cause about 15% of the deaths in the United States. And then the third modifiable risk factor that has the largest chunk of the pie is alcohol consumption, with 3.5% of the all-cause mortality. So in other words, people die regardless of what actually killed them. And alcohol is associated with their deaths. So the best thing that a person can do is not smoke. That's easy to do it's easy to do if you've never started. If you have started, compared to adopting a physical activity regimen and controlling your diet, it's probably a little easier. Of course, not being a smoker myself, maybe I'm wrong in saying that, but it's probably easier to not do something than it is to have to do something. So the best thing you can do is not smoke, but a close second is going to be eating a good diet and having good physical activity habits. So let's just branch off from that for a second, though, and look at common risk factors that are associated with poor health and mortality outcomes. So we have this separated out into biological factors, environmental factors, and behavioral factors. And biological factors, for the most part, are non-modifiable, meaning that we can't really do anything about it. We're just born with it, or it's something that we've developed, and it's set. There's nothing we can do about it. So things like your age, your sex, your race, your genetic predisposition for disease. Those are things that there's really nothing you can do about it. The environmental factors tend to be semi-modifiable, and what I mean by that is, for some people, they can move, they can get a better environment, they can, get new friends, whatever it be. But for other people, a lot of people, their environment is kind of set. They're linked to their family for various reasons and they can't move away from them, or they have financial reasons why they can't move. And so things like pollution and crime and low income, poor housing, those are all things that can sometimes be modified, but oftentimes they can't be. And what we are really going to focus on are the behavioral risk factors, because they tend to be highly modifiable. All right, again, I already mentioned smoking, I already mentioned exercise or physical activity, which falls under this sedentarism category. So sedentarism meaning a person who is sedentary or a person who is not physically active. Poor diet, alcohol, stress, drugs, all those things are modifiable risk factors that if you don't do what you're supposed to do in those areas, it's going to lead to poor health outcomes and potentially early mortality or death. So the focus of this class is going to be exercise and physical activity, so we're not going to talk as much about the diet and that sort of stuff. So let's just for a moment, though, define physical activity and define exercise, because they're not exactly the same thing. So physical activity is basically any bodily movement that's going to be produced by the contraction of skeletal muscle, that's going to, typically we define it as something that is going to use a fair amount of energy or have a large caloric requirements. For instance, we're going to categorize as physical activity things like walking your dog, or potentially yard work, stuff like that. But we're not going to associate with physical activity things like holding the remote control of a TV. That's just not going to have the caloric requirements enough to make it a part of physical activity. Within physical activity, we have several categories of activities and types of activities, one of which is the one we're going to focus the most on in this course, and that is exercise. So exercise is a subset of physical activity. So all exercise is physical activity, but not all physical activity is exercise. And the difference is exercise is going to be physical activity that is planned, structured, and repetitive. And it's specifically done to improve or maintain the fitness of the individual. So that is what exercise is. Where physical activity can include things like walking your dog, doing yard work, doing light work around the house. Exercise tends to be more the kind of things we associate with fitness, things like running, cycling, swimming, maybe even playing some sort of sports like basketball or soccer. Those are exercise, which again is a subset of physical activity. On this slide, I'm going to be referring to figure 1.1 from the ACSM guidelines textbook. So you can find that textbook again by scanning this QR code, but please go ahead and get out that textbook now and flip to figure 1.1. And so what this is showing is on the x-axis, we have the percentile rank for physical activity and fitness. So as people go further on the right on this graph, they're going to have a greater physical activity and a greater fitness. And then on the y-axis, we have their relative risk. So a relative risk of 1 means you're equally as likely to die as somebody who is not physically fit and has poor physical activity patterns. So as we go up in the percentile rank for physical activity and fitness, what we're going to see is that the relative risk of that individual is going to come down substantially. So for physical activity, for instance, it comes down around 25%. So you're 25% less likely to die if you're highly physically active versus somebody who is not physically active at all. So somebody who's sedentary. For fitness, if you are highly fit, you are about 60% less likely to die than somebody who is not fit at all. So physical activity and fitness both are going to impact your relative risk of disease and death. Fitness a little more so than physical activity, but they're both independent predictors of mortality and death. On this slide, I'm also going to be pulling from a figure that can be found in the ACSM guidelines, 10th edition guidelines textbook, but you can also find the original data of this. It's in a little bit of a different type of graph, but you can find the original data at this link here, which is what this QR code is going to. So if you want to see the textbook version of this, go look at your ACSM guidelines 10th edition. If you want the original data, look here at the New England Journal of Medicine's research article on this topic. And so really what we're asking here with this is exercise dangerous? And to put it simply before we get to the data, yes, exercise is dangerous. However, being sedentary, so the opposite of exercise, so having very little physical activity in your life, is actually far more dangerous than exercise. So if you're not going to exercise, you're actually at greater risk than if you do exercise. And so let's look at the figures together. So I'm going to be looking at the ACSM version, but again, you can get the same data from the New England Journal of Medicine link here or QR code there. So essentially we have people split up in two ways: people who are sedentary and people who are physically active and perform vigorous exercise on either 1 to 2 days per week, 3 to 4 days per week, or 5 or more days per week. When you take the person who is active, they have half the risk on a day that they're not active as someone who is sedentary on a similar day where they're also not active. So if you are exercising on a regular basis, you're going to have half the risk that someone who does not exercise has. So that's a huge improvement on a day-to-day basis. So again, talking about the dangers of exercise, if you exercise and you're a sedentary individual and you exercise at a vigorous intensity, that's going to increase your risk of a heart attack or some other sort of acute myocardial event by about 100 times during or the hours immediately following that bout of exercise. So yes, it is dangerous, especially for somebody who doesn't exercise. And that's what we're going to get to in the next couple things I talk about. So now if you exercise at a vigorous intensity 1 to 2 days per week, while you exercise or immediately after in those following hours where your risk level is highest, your risk level is only going to go up about 30 times compared to what it was if you didn't exercise at all. So from 100 times to 30 times is a huge improvement just by being vigorously active 1 to 2 days per week. Now if we go up to 3 to 4 days per week, the risk level only goes up by about 8 or so. So now again, from 100 to 30, now down to 8, so huge improvements. Now if you're heavily active, somebody who's active 5 or more days per week, now your risk level during or immediately after that activity only goes up by about 1.5 to 2 times. So minimal increase on what was already a really low level of risk. So the point here being is exercise dangerous? Yes, it can be during exercise or the hours immediately after exercise, especially vigorous intensity exercise. Your risk of an acute myocardial infarction or a heart attack are going to go up substantially. However, your risk is pretty low anyways, so an increase is you're still unlikely to have a heart attack. But regardless, you're much less likely if you do it on a regular basis than if you just do it once in a blue moon. So your best bet is going to be to have physical activity be a part of your regular routine, so that not only is your risk when you're active much lower, but your risk when you're not active is actually half as much as it would be if you were not active at all. So again, exercise is dangerous, but much less dangerous than being sedentary. On that note, let's look at some of the benefits of exercise beyond just reduction of things like myocardial infarction or heart attack and death. So reduction in body weight, decreased risk of stroke, decreased risk of metabolic syndrome, decreased risk of hypertension or high blood pressure, decreased risk of type 2 diabetes, decreased depression, decreased anxiety, decreases in some forms of cancer, decreases in arthritis, decreases in your risk of falling, which when you become older, especially at the elderly level, falling is one of the major ways people get hurt and actually die from complications from the fall. So a decrease in fall risk is actually really important. It's also going to elevate your mood. It's going to increase your perceptions of energy, so you're going to feel like you have more energy throughout the day, and you're going to sleep better. And this is just a relatively short list of the benefits of exercise. So it could be much longer than what I showed here. But the point is, exercise is really good for a lot of things. Thinking about health promotion and goals and those sorts of things, this exists on a continuum. And that continuum is health on one side, fitness in the middle, and exercise, athletic type performance on the other side. What I mean by having a health, fitness, and performance continuum is that obviously these are related to each other. They're all outcomes related to physical activity and exercise. However, the types of outcomes are going to be cumulative. So if you're exercising at a moderate intensity, you're probably only going to get the health outcomes, meaning decreased risks of all-cause mortality and decreased obesity, all those sorts of things. And while those are probably the most important outcomes, there are other outcomes that are worthwhile as well. So if you increase from a moderate intensity to vigorous intensity exercise, now you're going to start getting more fitness outcomes. So it's going to become easier to do things on a regular basis. Walking up the steps are going to be easier. You're going to be less winded when you get to the top. You're going to feel less tired when you get to the top. Along with lots of other things, it's going to increase your capacity for physical activity so you can do more in a day. It's also going to increase your body aesthetics because you're going to lower your body fat and increase your lean muscle mass, which are things we generally associate with good looks. If you increase the intensity even further and start to incorporate lots of vigorous activity or some potentially even near maximal activity, the types of things that we associate with sports, that's going to increase your performance abilities. So again, that's why we associate with sports, is because people who are athletes tend to exercise at really high intensities and do so in order to be able to exercise at those high intensities during their sport. So for not all people want that, though. That's something that you as the future or current fitness professional need to be aware of, is that the goals of people are going to determine the requirements that they need to meet. All right, everybody needs to at least meet the health requirements, but going beyond that is only going to be necessary if that is what the client wants. So if the client doesn't care to be able to run a mile quickly, then there's no reason to get them to this level of intensity. You can stop at one of these lower levels of intensity and still meet all their goals and desired outcomes. And as long as they're meeting the health outcomes or the health goals, then they're probably going to do just fine anyways. So this particular class is going to focus mostly on health and fitness. We're not going to be focusing on performance. Other classes will focus on those sorts of things. We are going to be mostly talking about the general public, where health and fitness is really all they're after. Most of them are not athletes. All right, so again, make sure that when you're thinking about exercise and exercise goals and exercise prescription for your clients, you're taking what they want into consideration and you're not just pushing onto them your own desires and what you're used to doing. So on that topic, how much exercise is enough? And these recommendations are going to be specific about health, not so much the fitness and athletic performance side of things. So if you meet these recommendations, you're most likely going to have health-oriented outcomes, not so much the others, unless you start pushing into the vigorous levels of intensity and beyond. All right, so for aerobic exercise, you need at least 30 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic exercise 5 days per week, or you can do 20 minutes of vigorous intensity aerobic exercise 3 days per week. Also, you can combine the two and do somewhere in the middle if you're doing both moderate and vigorous intensity exercise on some days. For resistance exercise, we need moderate to high intensity resistance exercise that is training all the major muscle groups on equal to or more than 2 days per week. And this is important because while there are some overlap between the benefits of aerobic and resistance exercise does have different benefits that aerobic exercise does not, and vice versa, aerobic exercise has some benefits that resistance exercise does not. So you do need to do both of these. And one of the key differences is resistance exercise is going to build lean tissue mass, and it's also going to build bone density better than what aerobic exercise can. Doing more than just the minimum recommendations that are listed here will turn into greater outcomes, whether it's health, fitness, or athletic performance outcomes. However, these are the bare minimum recommended by the ACSM, or the American College of Sports Medicine. All right, so with all these in mind, let's talk about how many people across the globe actually meet these recommendations. As mentioned before, physical inactivity or sedentarism is something that is a major problem. It's a modifiable risk factor, and unfortunately, it's a global pandemic. In the United States alone, 51.6% of adults meet the aerobic exercise requirements, which means about half of the adults don't meet this requirement. 29% meet the strength training, so the resistance training guidelines, which again means about 70% of adults in the United States do not meet the resistance training requirements. And when we combine the two together, which everybody should be doing both, only 20% of adults in the United States actually meet both requirements for aerobic exercise and resistance exercise. So 80% of the adults are not meeting the ACSM guidelines for exercise. And this is a really big deal for think about all the benefits of exercise, and now all those benefits are not being seen by 80% of the adult population in the United States. These numbers are focused on the United States, but these numbers are very similar to what most industrial societies across the globe are seeing. Talking about research and sources of information, this is a chart that I have created that I want my students to follow, because it gives an idea of what are good and credible sources and what are not so credible sources. And this is essentially a ranked order as well. And it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. So we have our trust level, so how much I perceive the ability to trust that type of source. We have whatever that source is, and then we have some common characteristics of that source that essentially lead me to how much I trust it. Okay, so at the top of this list, we have major organizations' position statements. And the reason why I put them at the very top as the most trustworthy is because it's usually based on large committees of experts that are people who do the research in this field, who know the pitfalls, know the limitations, as well as know, again, the strong suits of that research. And they put it all together, they get into a room or some sort of virtual space or whatever they need to do in order to meet and talk to each other, and they essentially argue it out until they come to conclusions that everybody or most people agree to. So with that being said, major organizations' position statements are going to be probably your best bet as far as getting credible information. However, it's not exactly going to be cutting edge information because it's something that most people agree to. It's not new, it's not still being worked out for the most part. Coming down a level from that, we have reputable textbooks. There are several of these out there for exercise physiology. I'll put some in the description below that you can use for this course and others. The difference between the reputable textbooks and the position statements is, while the position statements were large committees of the experts in the field, the most well-known, most renowned researchers out there, textbooks are written usually by a handful of reasonably well-known individuals. Sometimes they are the best, but there's still just a small collection of the best, so you don't get as many opinions coming together in order to create the content, and so the textbooks aren't quite as good as the position statements. The next one down is a journal review article. So this is when a research journal publishes the work of usually 1, 2, maybe even a couple more than that, but just a select number of researchers, and it goes through a peer review process. And the real difference between the textbooks and the review article is the fact that the textbooks are typically older information, more well-established information, where the review articles are oftentimes getting more towards the cutting edge. They're still not necessarily cutting edge, but they do pull in the newer research that's out there much more so than the textbooks. So it's when you pull in new information, there's going to be flaws in the information that some of it we know, and some of it we won't know until the future when new information comes out that proves them wrong. So because of that, it's not quite as trustworthy of a source, but it is still a really good resource. The next source of information would be a journal peer-reviewed original research article. So a review article was when they take a bunch of these original research articles, combine them together into some sort of summary of what's known or what's out there on a topic. All right, so this, though, is just a single research study done by 1-2 experts, maybe a couple more experts, some student researchers. They put their efforts together and they conduct a research study, they analyze that study, and they publish it. Every study has flaws, every study has limitations, so it's good, it's peer-reviewed, which is the gold standard for literature, is to have it to be peer-reviewed, but it is only one attempt to answer that question. And because of flaws that are often identified by the researchers themselves in their limitations section, as well as flaws that we don't know yet because there's just information that we still haven't figured out, no one paper or one research article is the definitive answer on any question. So again, really good information, but not quite as trustworthy as the information up here. It's more likely to be sort of overturned by research that will come out in the future. The next step down would be a website from a major organization in our field. And I'll give you a list of some of those organizations on the next slide here. But organizations like the American College of Sports Medicine. So major organizations where exercise is what they do. Those are the types of websites I'm talking about. So oftentimes their websites are going to be where you can find their position statements, but they usually have some lay versions of those position statements that are a little easier, a little shorter, and that are just in sort of website formats. And so good information, much more lay oftentimes, meaning it's not quite as nuanced. It doesn't take into account all the limitations and whatever might prevent that research from being ideal or perfect. It's not going to really go into that. It's just going to kind of tell you the summary of the end result and what they currently think based on these other sources of information. So still pretty good. In my class, specifically in an undergraduate level class, you can cite anything within this green box here that I've already gone over. Anything in that green box is going to be good sources of information that are probably going to be accurate, or at least as accurate as we have right now. So the next step down is a conference proceeding or a research abstract. This is essentially the precursor to a journal peer-reviewed original research article. So oftentimes people will present their research at a conference when it's still at the preliminary stages, when they're not exactly sure what's going on, they're still collecting data oftentimes, and then they will go and publish it when they finish the study. So it's okay information, it's interesting information, but it's oftentimes not going to be the final results of that study, so it's not something that you should be citing in most of your classes. Unless there's literally nothing else out there on the topic, then maybe you can cite it. But typically that's not the case. The next one down would be websites from an organization that's not a major organization in the field. So this could be some small group, a gym, a blog, that kind of thing. Usually it's the information is only half good, half not so good. Think about magazine companies that have websites, your Muscle and Fitness, those sorts of websites. They're okay. They have some good information, but they're often sensationalized in some way in order to bring viewers in, and it's really not the best content. And there's usually a lot of flaws in the content, and the people writing the content oftentimes don't have as much information as they should to speak as authoritatively as they do on the topic. The next one on the list is companies trying to promote a product. So if someone's trying to sell you something, whether it's a gym membership or a piece of equipment or a supplement or some sort of dietary plan, whatever it is, don't trust them. All right, they're trying to get your money. They'll say whatever is necessary to get that money. And of course, there are some good companies out there who won't sort of bend and manipulate things in order to get your money. But most companies are going to do what they need to in order to stay afloat or to prosper within this field. And there's a lot of really terrible companies in the exercise physiology and the exercise realm in general. So don't trust someone who's trying to sell you something. And the last one on this list is any random person that you meet. So most often this is going to be some random person you meet at the gym who thinks they know everything, who's going to tell you what you're doing right and wrong, who's going to probably interrupt you while you're exercising to tell you how you should be exercising. Or this could be your coaches, your teammates, parents, friends, whatever it be, even myself. I'm coming to you, trying my best to give you good information, but I'm not the final source of this information. I'm getting my information from other sources and trying to give that to you in a nice, user-friendly manner. But before you believe me, before you trust what I say, you really should go and look it up for yourself, especially if it's going to be used in a context where there's risk involved, or if you're going to be making career-type decisions based on the information I give you. You shouldn't trust me. You should trust no one. You should only trust yourself and the information that you get from credible sources that are peer-reviewed, that are from major organizations, the kind of sources that I listed up here. So again, I would be listed as a random person that you may or may not know. All right, so it's not someone you should trust. No one person is someone you should trust. If they say they know everything, they're lying to you. So don't trust anyone. Look it up for yourself. Here's that list of major credible organizations that provide a lot of information in this field that I was discussing on the previous slide. So the two big ones I really want to talk about here are the American College of Sports Medicine, or the ACSM, and the National Strength and Conditioning Association, the NSCA. These are the two largest organizations in the exercise realm. The biggest being ACSM by far. It's probably 2 to 3 times as big as the NSCA, but they're both way bigger than any of the exercise organizations down here. However, a lot of these are organizations that are bigger than this, but they just don't focus on exercise. For instance, the National Institutes of Health, the Center for Disease Control, they do make some recommendations about exercise, but they do lots of other things. So I'm not saying they are smaller than the ACSM, but organizations like, for instance, the American Council on Exercise is much smaller than the ACSM. So the ACSM really is probably the best organization in this field. NSCA is probably the next best, followed by some of these other exercise organizations down here. And then all these other organizations that are listed here are just good organizations that do still publish exercise-related information, but not necessarily exclusively. And if you're trying to find information, research-based information in this field, great ways to do so would be to go to a search engine or a database that collects research. So the best two out there, in my opinion, are PubMed, so you can find them at this website, or if you scan this QR code, it'll take you to this website. The next one is Google Scholar. Here is the website for that, and here is a QR code that will take you to that website. Both of these are going to have original research, peer-reviewed research primarily. Google Scholar is not quite as filtered as PubMed. PubMed, the research is generally good, peer-reviewed research. Google Scholar oftentimes is, but occasionally some things slip in that maybe aren't as high quality as what you would find in PubMed. So if you find it in PubMed, it's probably pretty good. If you find it in Google Scholar, it's generally pretty good, but both are going to have some not so good stuff. Google Scholar is going to have a little more of the not so good stuff, but to be quite honest, I use Google Scholar the most just because it's a little more user friendly. It's important for us to know what exactly the outcomes we are looking at are when we're talking about things like fitness. All right, so the ACSM defines 5 health-related components of fitness, and then if you are going to do more of the athletic side of things, or if you're working with somebody whose activities of daily living are becoming limited, then we also have 6 skill-related components of fitness here. So the quickly go over these. The 5 health-related components, which are the minimal that you really should be testing when you're working with a new client, are cardiorespiratory endurance, which is the ability of the cardiovascular system to work with the respiratory system to get blood and oxygen around the body so that you can sustain physical activity. So that's a fancy way of saying your aerobic fitness. You have body composition, which is essentially your muscle and your fats and bone and other parts of the body, and how much of your body is made up of those. Primarily, we tend to focus on your body fat percentage when we look at body composition. Muscular strength, now we're looking at how much force a muscle or muscle group can produce in a maximal effort. Muscular endurance, you're looking at your ability to perform some sort of muscular task and to do it repetitively or for once continuous action for a long time without fatiguing. Flexibility, this is your ability to move your joints through a range of motion. So your ability to move your shoulder all the way through its range of motion, your hip all the way through its range of motion, that is measured through flexibility. So again, these are the 5 health-related components of fitness, but we also have these skill-related components, which we're not going to focus on nearly as much in this course, but I do want to go over them quickly here. We have agility, which is your ability to move your body through positions in space and to do so quickly and rapidly and with great accuracy. So obviously that's really important for athletic performance, but it's also important if you're somebody who is getting more frail and elderly and who's trying to maintain activities of daily living, because your ability to kind of get around accurately is going to be important for that. Your coordination, so this is your ability to use the senses that you have, so your sight, your hearing, your bodily kinesthesia, so your senses of where your body is in space, in order to perform a task in a smooth and coordinated fashion. Next is balance, which is your ability to maintain your equilibrium, so in other words, to stay upright or to stay in the position that you want to be in, whether it's upright or supine or laying on your side or whatever that is, or your ability to regain your equilibrium after something knocks it off. So if you were to trip, your ability to prevent yourself from falling, kind of a situation. Your power, so this is specifically talking about muscular power most of the time. This is your ability to produce force quickly. All right, so we talked up here about muscular strength, which is the ability to produce a lot of force, but we weren't talking about how fast you produce that force. Muscular power is when we actually look at how fast you're producing that force. Reaction time, so this is your ability to respond to some sort of stimulus in your environment, whether it's something you see, something you hear, how quickly you can change and react to that. That is your reaction time. And then the last skill-related component is your speed, so how quickly you can move. So think about sprinting speed here. But this is also something that's going to be important. Again, if you start thinking about the older, elderly people, their ability to move quickly from one place to another is going to allow them to get out of the way of, say, a moving car, or to just be able to kind of get through their day and to do so with relative ease. The last thing I want to talk about in this video is a sequence of exercise prescription tasks that I recommend, and you're going to see this sequence in all of the videos in this lecture series for this course. So the first thing that I recommend you do is to become educated on exercise physiology and its related topics. We're going to cover a little bit of that in this class. You really should take an exercise physiology course before or during this course so that you can really solidify the information we're covering in this course, because we're going to kind of brief past some of that exercise physiology. And so what I'm actually going to do is put a card in here as well as a link in the description below for a lecture series that I have on exercise physiology that will hopefully help with this. We need to learn about legal considerations, things like the various safeguards to prevent yourself from getting sued or from doing something illegal. We'll talk about things like insurance in a coming video. So we also need to learn about informed consent. So you need to or you need to do an informed consent. So you need to tell the person what you plan on doing with them and have them agree to it and understand the risks of that activity. The next thing is you need to perform. So these are the things you need to do in order to actually work with the client. So the next thing you need to do working with the client is to get their health history or medical history. And you're going to be doing that to find out what kind of issues they have that may affect their ability to exercise safely or their ability to exercise at certain intensities or do certain types of tasks. The next thing that you would do is do a risk assessment, which is associated with a screening. Essentially, you're looking for different contraindications to exercise or even just risks to their health that they should know about, that you should have a conversation with them. So things like smoking, right? So if they smoke, that's a risk factor, and you should have a conversation with them about that in smoking cessation for that individual. The next thing you would do is complete all of your resting tests. So tests that don't actually involve physical activity of any kind. So things like resting blood pressure, resting heart rate, electrocardiogram, their height, their weight, their body composition that was discussed on the previous slide. All those can be done at rest without them exercising, and so those should happen first because they are going to be affected by the things that would come later, which is going to require exercise. So, for instance, you wouldn't want to try to measure someone's resting blood pressure after having them do some sort of bicycle test, because it's going to take a long time for the resting blood pressure to return. So the next thing you would do are the cardiorespiratory fitness testing. So this is things like measuring their VO2 max, which we'll talk about later on. And actually all these topics are things we're going to go to later on in this course. And so let's go ahead and skip past this for now. It's a pretty complicated topic that we'll get to later on. You're also going to want to test their muscular strength and endurance. And I will say that some of these exercise testing orders are going to be different depending on where you look, and they may even be different depending on which video in this series that you watch. But essentially these need to happen close together, and the actual order is going to be based somewhat on opinion, based on the test that you're actually using, as well as based on the source that you look at. So after the cardiorespiratory fitness testing, you would test their muscular strength and endurance. Following that, you would test their flexibility now that they're warmed up. And then finally, you start to establish goals with the individual. So you ask them what they want to do after giving them the information from all these fitness tests and letting them know where they are strong and where they are weak and where they may want to think about trying to improve themselves. So that's when you would establish goals, and from the goals you'd prescribe the exercise. Then eventually you would schedule a retest of all the fitness tests that you did to see if your exercise prescription plan actually made them better or not. And if not, that's okay. Sometimes you obviously don't want that, but if it happens, that means you need to adapt the prescription plan so that the next time you do a retest, they actually do get better. If they have gotten better, maybe that's time to bump it up again as well, so that they continue to get better for the next time you test them. All right, so this is the end of what we're going to cover in this lecture. This, again, it was just an introduction to the topic of exercise testing and exercise prescription. We're going to go into each of these topics listed here in further detail in future videos within this lecture set, so please come back and watch one of those. Thanks.